Welcome to the History Nerds and I podcast. I am your head nerd, Brendan. Thank you so much for being here. Today we have author Scott McGaugh and his book, Brotherhood of the Flying Coffin, about World War II glider pilots. First of all, it's an awesome name for a book, and it's an awesome book too, so that kind of lines up. Scott's one of those guys too, as we were just talking about this, I could feel how much he cared about this subject and how much effort he put into it. As somebody who takes that time and does that, it puts you in a good mood. This was a great conversation. So why am I still talking? Let's shut up and get to Scott. And here we are with author Scott McGaugh, Brotherhood of the Flying Coffin, the Glider Pilots of World War II. Scott, thank you so much for coming on. My pleasure.
It's a real delight to share this amazing part of the greatest generation with all your listeners.
Now, before we jump into the book, you're a bigwig at the Midway Museum. Now, you've been doing it for years, and you kind of retired, but you're not really retired. How did you even get involved with the Midway Museum?
Well, back in the mid-'90s, when you were probably 12, I had a public relations agency, and the group that was trying to bring Midway to San Diego asked if I would donate 3 months of my time to do some PR and so on. And I'm born and raised in San Diego, which makes me an endangered species. I thought it was a great idea for my hometown. And so I volunteered for 3 months, and it turned into 8 years of volunteering on the board. When Midway finally arrived, they asked me to become the marketing director for 17 years. Retired in 2020 and have returned to the board of directors today. So a 90-day engagement is now something like 25 years and counting. And I've never done anything remotely as rewarding as being part of the Midway family.
Now, since you're so important, I want to know, I come to San Diego, you come with me, you bring me into the museum. Am I now allowed to get into any plane I want to? Do you have that kind of pull?
No, if only because many of the aircraft, the cockpits are sealed from a weather standpoint up on the flight deck and not necessarily restored inside when visitors, more than 1 million every year, are really looking at the outside. However, I could get you into the cockpit of an F-14 Tomcat of Top Gun fame. You can be a Maverick. You can sit in the front seat. It was used as a training simulator for Tomcat fighter pilots and made available to us. So it's the real deal in terms of all the controls, the lack of comfort and so on. I can be Goose, and we can just use our imaginations, because if you and I took off in a Tomcat in the morning here in San Diego, we could be in New York in time for lunch at Mach 2, 1,500 miles an hour. Brendan, to sit in these cockpits that are available and see how uncomfortable, cramped, somewhat primitive feeling they are, and then imagine what naval aviators go through up in the air over time in history and today. It really is remarkable, and it gives you a whole different sense than simply watching the movies.
Well, Scott, I accept, and we've recorded this, so you can't go back on it.
There you go. All right.
But it's the perfect segue to go from, hey, it's not quite comfortable in a plane like that, to something way more uncomfortable. But first, before we even get into the details, I will say, without equivocation, this is one of the top 5 best titles of books I've read in my life. Brotherhood of the Flying Coffin. Who came up with it? Was that all you, or did somebody give you the idea?
No, it's kind of a combination of things. Some glider pilots called their gliders a flying coffin, although they actually proved to be remarkably sturdy for what they were. But from all appearances, it certainly made sense. They were also called flak bait and purple heart boxes because they were so vulnerable, or the pilots were in the infantry, to enemy fire. So the phrase flying coffin was around, and my agent in New York, when he read the manuscript, remarked that, this is a remarkable slice of, a brotherhood slice of the greatest generation. There really is a unique brotherhood, within the overall World War II story that hasn't been told. And from there, it was a pretty easy one, the Brotherhood of the Flying Coffin. The publisher loved it. Oftentimes, a writer, an author will sometimes have challenges with the publisher in terms of what would be the best title, what might sell, what might turn people off, what's not politically correct anymore. But there was never any question about this one. Your instincts were spot on, and it's proven to be a very popular summation of their legacy.
Now, I am an Army combat vet. I used to be a tanker, and I know military guys will do crazy things. Guys and gals. Back then it was just guys, but guys and gals now.
Yes.
This is, to me, is insane. The entire idea of gliders. Can you just, for people who don't understand, what was a glider in World War II, right? You have a plane. Everyone knows what that is. How was a glider different from a plane?
A glider was about the size of a B-24 bomber. except it was tubular steel frame covered in reinforced fabric with no motors, no parachutes, no second chances, carrying a couple tons of either cargo or infantry, towed about a football field behind a tow plane, anywhere from literally hours from England to France into enemy territory, landing one-way missions behind the front lines. So these young men were not only flying a primitive-looking aircraft that was defenseless, they knew they were going to be landing in an area where they would immediately be surrounded, get out of that glider, and complete their mission. But back to your question, it was a flying box kite in many ways. Some called it an airborne trailer, if you will. But again, motorless, being towed by a plane, sometimes only 500 feet off the ground, well within range of enemy fire.
I mean, when you really think about it, it's also akin to a lawn dart, basically, right? Like, you won't be able to fly a plane and land it in the middle of a field, but with a glider, maybe you can just, almost face plant, right?
In many ways. Again, they were remarkably sturdy in terms of survivability in many ways, given exactly what you're talking about. A tow plane would release the glider, hopefully within range of the anticipated landing zone, maybe at 500 feet. So that glider pilot might have a minute or so to get on the ground, and he's dropping right away at a descent rate of 950 feet a minute. So they had very little time to find a spot, avoid the other gliders in the air, and get down. Or the tow pilot may have had to release the glider pilot at 1,500 feet or 2,000 feet because of complications in the mission. And now that glider pilot and his co-pilot had several minutes of enduring enemy fire to get down to the ground. So simply releasing and getting on the ground was far from simple by any stretch, or they may be off target. They may be 10 miles farther into enemy territory than where they anticipated because of weather and fog banks going across the English Channel. So it was a dicey proposition. Glider pilots had little choice other than to wait to be released in general terms and then make the best of the situation and get on the ground as quickly as possible.
Well, luckily, with something this complicated and with this much danger, I'm sure the American military at the beginning of World War II put plenty of resources and training into this program, right?
Oh, sure. Imagine if you were 20, 21 years old at Pearl Harbor on December 7th. Imagine volunteering to fly an aircraft, combat aircraft, not yet invented, and begin training to fly a combat aircraft behind enemy lines, one-way missions, with none available to train in until a little bit later in the war. The point being, this literally was a combat aviation technique that did not exist on December 7th. So it was a mad dash. It took about a year to come up with the design, and then finding contractors. Oh, wait, none of them have ever built a glider before, quality control and so on. And that was a fiasco, while inventing training techniques with civilian gliders, sailplanes, at least in the beginning, until some of these combat gliders came off the line. So the early quality was horrific. Wings would fall off in midair. Tow pilots had to be trained. They had never towed a glider in their lives. That had never been around before. So all this was taking place. Inspector generals found that one manufacturer was building his prototype in a dry cleaning shop with the wings sticking out of the window. Another fellow tried to build gliders under a circus tent in Florida, where the humidity made the glue fail 90% of the time. But that didn't matter because a hurricane came along and blew the whole thing away. While these 21-year-olds leaving families at home are training to figure out how they're going to fly these things once they finally became available. So training techniques, qualifications to get into the schools were constantly changing until finally, really with the start with Normandy, they became operational. But even at that, they were largely test pilots, Brendan, from one mission to the next, because again, this had never been done before. And they were learning sometimes at the cost of their lives, just how to contribute to victory in Europe.
I mean, I really want to point out something that you're saying, and reading it in the book, it already sounds insane, but it gets more insane. We're not talking about manufacturers like, oh, yeah, Boeing is making this and figuring it. No, it's not Lockheed that's figuring this out, right? These are places that have no business doing anything aviation that are bidding to make these gliders, right?
Absolutely. And that was a big part of the mobilization manufacturing-wise for the war. A.J. Heinz Ketchup Company got a contract to make certain components. A refrigerator company made different, hundreds and hundreds of subcontractors. A casket company, not a good sign. was making other components. Steinway Pianos was making components, all feeding about a dozen, quote, aircraft manufacturers, only one, Cessna, that was actually qualified and experienced in building any kind of aircraft. Ironically, I suppose, but maybe not too surprising, the most effective production ultimately took place thanks to Ford Motor Company. They knew how to mass assemble vehicles, if you will. They converted a station wagon plant into a glider plant. I think it was Minnesota, if I recall. And they far and away produced more gliders and probably better quality gliders than anyone else.
And then I'm, just like you were saying, I'm going to put myself in the position of someone, because very often these guys wanted to fly actual planes and this was their backup. But I'm thinking of just, you're standing in the middle of, let's say, nowhere, Texas. That's one of the places. And your glider shows up, right?
Right.
When that glider shows up, it's not like, oh, somebody landed a plane, here it is, right? It's almost, oh, hey, here are the boxes, put together your glider, right?
Well, yes. Domestically, they largely came, once they finally got to the training field, they were in place. You look at a photo of a glider in World War II, it's hard to imagine. There were 70,000 pieces, the jigsaw puzzle, if you will, that had to be put together. So the glider pilots themselves, or other people who had to learn how, some assembly required, had to put these together and hopefully do it correctly. There was another variable. And literally when they were then shipped to Europe later, 5 massive wood crates, 10,000 board feet of lumber were required for each glider to build the 5 shipping crates. And then it would take weeks and weeks and months to assemble hundreds and hundreds of gliders for these pilots and ultimately to take a seat, strap in, and fly into combat.
Well, thankfully, I'm sure there was very robust training. Oh, no, wait, these things didn't exist yet. So they were also learning on the job as they were showing up, right?
They were. Since they didn't exist, some of the initial training was in sailplanes, which is fine. But with sailplanes, you want to stay up in the air as long as possible, the thermals and so on. Whereas in combat, you want to get on the ground as quickly as you can. So they had to use sailplanes in the beginning. Later, they took motors out of small civilian aircraft. So they would sink like a combat glider, and kind of get a sense of what that was going to be like. And finally, after about a year, the real combat gliders began arriving, primarily in Lubbock, Texas, the main training area, main school. So they did have combat glider experience before they shipped out to Europe.
Now, what were the higher-ups thinking as the training program is going along, right? Because this is not without its growing pains, and that's putting it lightly. People are dying in training.
Sure.
Will we say regularly? How often would we be seeing these just horrific things that can go wrong?
By the end of the war, there were almost as many deaths in training as in combat, when you add up all the numbers, but relatively low casualty rate, or killed in action anyway, rate. So it wasn't so much that, it was really defining and refining and discovering how to train these men for combat. And then there was a great amount of learning from one mission to the next. They were test pilots in many ways from one mission to the next. And the results showed that as the war went on in the last year. They ultimately flew and contributed to success in 5 major missions, starting with Normandy, and forged a remarkable legacy in only 9 months. The war ended not more than a year, roughly, after Normandy in Europe. So ultimately, they were able to contribute in a way that's truly remarkable, given what we've just been talking about.
I mean, let's jump to that. Let's jump to the actual war. I'd like you, on a scale of absolute debacle to not as bad as we thought it could have been, let's start, their first they're coming out is the Sicily campaign, right? So North Africa, where they're going across the Mediterranean. How'd that first mission go?
Unmitigated disaster. Like a lot of the early war missions, it was, in retrospect, poorly planned. We're going to fly gliders at night all the way across the Mediterranean. As it turned out, in a storm, they're going to fly over the Allied fleet, and hopefully they get the word not to fire on these invaders. We're going to go ashore while surrounded on 3 sides by the enemy. We're going to do this with minimal training because the gliders were late in getting to Tunisia for trainings. No full-scale rehearsal, but let's give it a try, being a little facetious at the end there. And it was a disaster. Almost half of the gliders, the 150 gliders, never made it ashore. They were released too far out at sea due to conflicting and poorly communicated towing pilot orders. So they had no chance to make it ashore based on the altitude that they were released. More than 600 men lost their lives, most of them by drowning. So the gliders did not contribute anywhere near what they had anticipated. General Eisenhower was very doubtful at that point whether even major airborne operations had a role in World War II, given how badly Sicily went. But the tide turned about a year later at Normandy.
Which, that's the next one, right? So Normandy, D-Day, they are part of this program. I mean, how close did this get after Sicily to just be canceled? Like, not even bother?
I think it was fairly close. I think what probably carried the day is the need for the paratroopers and the airborne as part of Normandy. And, paratroopers, when they go into battle, they only carry a day or two, typically, of supplies and ammo. So if we're going to have paratroopers go in behind the front lines, we have to have a way to resupply them, typically within hours, with reinforcements, supplies, medical supplies, ammunition, ordnance, and so on. So in retrospect, I think in some respects, they had to make it work. They had to find a way to make it work because, the paratroop element of Normandy was always going to be a key part. So by the time Normandy came along, almost a year later, a great deal of learning had taken place. There were more gliders available for training, rehearsals, and so on. So while it was not a total success, it was still learning on the job. Gliders were far more effective at Normandy, 500 of them, than they had been at Sicily.
First of all, it's amazing that there were even pilots for this, right? It's a testament to these soldiers. They were chomping at the bit for round 2, even after how badly round 1 went, right?
Yes, and that amazes me. At one point there were 10,000 volunteers in the training pipeline back home. Young men were willing to do this, and obviously the reports from Sicily were not good, although government censors and so on, a lot of that was not publicly known at the time. They were willing to risk whatever it takes to, just going to do my job and get this thing done and get back home. That was the spirit of the greatest generation, and they were willing to do that.
So D-Day, it seems like we've ironed out, some of the problems and things like that. So next we go on to Market Garden. We've learned all of our lessons. We're not going to make any bad mistakes this time, right?
Oh, sure. And the weather's going to be great. We're going to be able to maintain the calendar and we'll land at 0900 and 1100 on day 1 and not so fast. A big part of glider warfare, I think, in World War II wasn't just the enemy, but the vagaries of war, weather. Flying 3 or 4 hours from England into France or Belgium or ultimately Germany, and the things that can go wrong that do go wrong with the tow planes and that sort of thing. So Market Garden stretched out over a much longer period of time. 1,900 gliders were part of this, and it went much better. They delivered 14,000 infantry, which were critically needed as this ground operation dragged to a halt and ultimately was largely a failure, at Arnhem and the bridge too far and all that. But I think the thing about Market Garden that I think it went, well considering is that 1,900 gliders and pilots, no trained glider pilots. There weren't enough to go around to put 2 men in each glider because they were holding many in reserve for a possible second invasion. So literally sometimes a glider infantryman in the back would be called forward just before they took off. You get a 10-minute brief on the tarmac and so, okay, you're now a co-pilot. Get in. I can't imagine being towed by a tow crew who's a stranger. You're trusting your life in their hands. And now you're going into combat and landing on the battlefield surrounded by the enemy with an untrained infantryman as your co-pilot. And yet that's exactly what they did and really accomplished their mission in fairly good order considering the complications in Market Garden.
And we're talking about how dangerous the actual glider can be just from the pieces of it and everything, but it seems like the second thing you had to worry about was your tow plane. If you could trust the tow plane that was going to, and for each of these missions, it seemed like the tow planes got different directions and orders on how they had to do it. If you had a good tow plane, they were going right through flak. They were making sure to get you there safe. If you had a bad tow plane, they might just let you go and say, hope it all turns out well for you. We're not anywhere near you're supposed to be, right?
Yeah, and I don't know if I would say good or bad tow plane. There's an expression in boxing. Every fighter has a game plan until he gets hit on the chin. And that's kind of, I think, in many ways, as you may know from your military service, that's the way it is in combat. They had communications between the tow planes and the gliders. It was a cable wrapped around the tow rope, very vulnerable to breaking, cracking, being shot away by shrapnel. They had a backup signaling system, but nonetheless, a lot of times they did not have communication. As I said earlier, weather could put tow planes off course. They had to come in higher. There's so many variables that would take place. And again, these pilots were strangers. They might have met for 5 minutes on the tarmac beforehand, but glider pilot units were often shifted from one air group to another. So they were blind dates in many ways. Didn't think about it that way until just now, but they were. Sometimes the glider pilots would release themselves if for whatever reason they felt the need, the circumstances dictated. But they did very much rely on the tow plane pilots to maintain course and altitude as best they could. But if a tow plane gets hit by artillery and is on fire and starts nosing in, so much for that battle plan. You do what you have to do and make the best of it.
And let's not forget, if that tow rope breaks, it might come straight through your glider and it's all over before you can even start.
Yeah, then you've got the challenge of exactly that. If either plane is, dodging and weaving, a glider doesn't do much of that. But there are many instances of the ropes, which is really nylon, failing or breaking, or shrapnel getting shot away. The last thing you wanted to do is see a 300-foot nylon tow rope come flying back at you, because these glider pilots were sitting elevated in cockpits, surrounded on three sides only by plexiglass. They were flying in an aquarium, if you will, in terms of being vulnerable to enemy fire, tow rope breaking and snapping back. That was the nature of the beast. So indeed, sometimes tow ropes became the principal threat.
So getting back to our missions, next up is Battle of the Bulge. How does this one go?
It was a shooting gallery. I'm sure many of your listeners know Battle of the Bulge. The 101st is surrounded at Bastogne. General Patton is making the mad dash, Third Army, up from the south. They're in big trouble, out of supplies, hundreds, if not more than 1,000 casualties. They need physicians and medical teams and so on. The day before Patton arrived, a small contingent of gliders got through. What is heartbreaking, Brendan, for me is the next day when the major mission took place to really resupply with gliders and more paratroopers, they could have flown over the route that Patton had just blazed into Bastogne, but they didn't get the orders in time. So rather than take a secure corridor, they flew the same route as the day before, same altitude. The Germans knew exactly where they were coming, and it was horrific. To give you an example, the last squadron of the 50-some gliders, last squadron of 12 gliders, 3 glider pilots were killed in action, 8 became POWs, and only 1 made it home the same day. And later on, when you read the glider pilots' recollections and oral histories and so on, and more than one occasion, I really sensed appropriately chip on their shoulder that some of them felt that Patton got all the credit, for rescuing the 101st at Bastogne, and that the glider pilots and what they endured and what they overcame have largely been overlooked in that story.
Well, I mean, we all know Patton needed to get his ego stroked as much as possible at all times. We're not going to go into him. It's not about him today. Not today. Not today. It's not about Patton today. And I want to just jump back real quick to something that you mentioned before we get to, the last major mission. Glider pilots, if they make it, if they land the plane, more likely crash the plane. If they land the glider, their job is to get out and try and get back to American lines so they can get back into a glider if they need to, right? Like it's not even like, now you're down, you're like a paratrooper, let's start shooting, let's, go into battle. It's like, no, because we don't have enough glider pilots, get out. If you survive, get back to the front lines, right?
You're right. The reality is, again, among the many, many lessons they learned, that they engaged in when you land, in a field and you're surrounded, you're going to engage in combat. And they did have some infantry training. I don't want to overstate that or oversimplify that, but you're absolutely right. Their mission was report to the senior glider officer on the field, on scene, if you will, as soon as they could, and probably have some guard duty, some secondary duty like that, but fundamentally get back to base, get back to the channel, hitch a ride on a boat back to your air base in England, whatever the case may be. By the final mission of the war, Varsity, in March, flying into the fatherland, it was interesting that by that point, they had formed the first all-officer infantry unit provisionally, and it was comprised of glider pilots. They were assigned a defensive position to guard a crossroads to keep the Germans from retreating, and in fact engaged in a vicious firefight the night of Varsity. So in many ways, they did contribute from a ground combat standpoint to some extent. But you're right. Their job was to deliver and get home within reason as quickly as possible. Get ready for the next mission.
And I mean, you already jumped into Varsity. My question for you, too, is especially as an author, this is something that is very often overlooked in World War II. Did you have a lot to work with as far as the writing is concerned, or was this more difficult than other books you've written?
Again, it's a good question. And the reality is, it wasn't that much more difficult than any of the others. First, there is the Silent Wings Museum in Lubbock, Texas, which is where the primary glider pilot training took place. And that museum is dedicated to the legacy of the glider pilots. And over the years, they, along with the National World War II Glider Pilots Association, have compiled, a lot of diaries and correspondence and oral histories and so on. And when you consider that there were 900 gliders in Operation Varsity in only 4 hours, there was a decent amount of first-person recollections and accounts and so on, pretty much in all the missions, with the exception of the relatively small Sicily mission. So reading through all that, making them making this available to me, this book would not exist. Their archives are truly the soul of this book. This book would not exist had they not been dedicated for 30-some years in preserving the archives and the legacy of World War II glider pilots.
Why do you think this isn't as covered? I mean, World War II in history is big business, right? The jokes are all made. You get older and you get into, smoking meats or World War II history, right? But this is very often just overlooked. I know when I'm reading the book, I'm almost thinking, if you're a higher up in the military, you want this story to go away. The way it was done, thank God that there were men willing to do this, right? Truly heroes, because this is dangerous stuff. And the way the higher level military did this, they were really playing with people's lives. Is there a political side of this where people don't want to talk about just how unsafe a lot of this was? Or is it just because it wasn't as big a part of World War II as some other things?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit more the latter. Any major battle, we're talking about the major invasions here across the European theater of operation, based on the number of people, they were a small group within a far greater, hundreds of thousands came ashore at Normandy, kind of a thing when we're talking about 500 glider pilots, if you will, or roughly 3,000 to 4,000, maybe 5,000 glider pilots saw combat in World War II compared to 75 to 80,000 paratroopers, much less the infantry numbers and so on. So I think in fairness, in retrospect, it was more a function of that. The role they played was very important and contributed to success. But it was just something that I think that for whatever reason was largely overlooked by civilian historians like me. And again, it's only been in the last 30 years to a certain extent, thanks to the Silent Wings Museum, that this material has been available because they've collected it from these veterans who, as you may know, a lot of times in the other books I've written, it's only in the last 10 or 15 years of these men's lives that they really start sharing, with their families and maybe the grandkids, usually not. And then when they pass away, grandma finds the box of memorabilia and journals and things that may even predate her and makes them available to the museum. And so it's really been an opportunity to chronicle their legacy, I think, more recently than, what was available in the public attention in 1965 about paratroopers, and the movies made about paratroopers and coming ashore and all those worthy acknowledgments. This one has kind of surfaced more in the last 25, 30 years, perhaps, than the others.
So what happens to the glider program post-World War II?
It's gone. It came on. Next question. No, it was discontinued within a couple of years. For all the contributions and extraordinary bravery of these glider pilots, technology, as in most wars, quickly outpaced the limitations of the gliders. The gliders required a lot of resources, the towing crews and tow planes and the air groups and so on. The ability to land precisely and on time when you don't have any power in your aircraft is questionable at best. Something called the helicopter was coming along at the end of the war to drop down into the battlefield with supplies and so on much more efficiently and cost effectively in many ways. So it just got to a point that it was clear that early in the war, everything was needed. And by the end of the war, we were getting smarter, if you will, in terms of what was necessary. So within a couple of years, it was discontinued. Almost no gliders were reserved for future museums. They were all sold off. You could buy a glider, again, the size of a B-24 bomber for $75. But the ironic thing is, what people were spending $75 on were those 5 wooden crates I talked about, 10,000 board feet of grade A lumber. You could build a small house, a patio, a deck, a granny flat, a barn, and so on, just from the shipping crates. So they suffered an ignominious, end, I think, given the sacrifice and the bravery of these men. And something else comes to mind, if I may. Every time a glider pilot flew a mission, he earned an air medal. That's an amazing thought when you realize that for fighter pilots, it took 10 missions bomber pilots 5. So the military recognized, I think, that this is an extraordinarily dangerous, risky proposition. So they were recognized, I think, in some ways that way. But in terms of post-war recognition, the movies and books and so on, it was a long time in coming.
So, Scott, I can't imagine anybody reading the title of this book and the dust jacket and not wanting to read it. But there are misguided people out there who say history is boring. That's something I had to do in high school. I'm never going to read history again. If I put one of those poor unfortunate souls in front of you and they said, why should I read Brotherhood of the Flying Coffin? What would you say to them?
Actually, I'd ask them about 3 or 4 questions, I think, if I think about it for a minute. This has kind of come up before with some of my other World War II books. But in this case, I'd ask you, if you're the one, would you have volunteered for World War II at the age of 20, 21, or 28 with 3 kids at home? Would you have volunteered to fly an aircraft not yet invented? Would you have volunteered to fly one-way missions into enemy territory, as we mentioned, with no motor, no parachutes, and no second chances? And if you would like to meet the young men who did exactly that, and maybe even have them over for dinner, then I think you'd really enjoy and be moved and inspired by the Brotherhood of the Flying Coffin.
Scott, there is no way to put it better than that. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
My pleasure, Brendan. Hope to talk again.
And that's it for this episode. Scott, thank you so much for coming on. Brotherhood of the Flying Coffin. Great book, everybody. Trust me, go out and get it. If you care at all about World War II, it is a must-read. Hit us up. Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. New YouTube channel. If you haven't subscribed yet, come on, please. Until next time, nerds. Stay cool.
History Nerds United.